My name is Elizabeth Belzil, and my presentation will be focused on dealing with issues of abuse, especially focused on helping children overcome traumatized minds. I found this was an important thing to focus on because children that are victims of abusive families are at risk for psychological and social issues due to their home environments. This presentation discusses issues that these children face and how to help them overcome issues in positive ways. It's important to keep in mind that connections in the brain are the basis of issues that children face as a result of abuse, and trauma greatly affects how the brain develops, which is why I chose to make it the focal point of this presentation. So the first point I would like to go over is significant impacts of the family system. So a vast majority of what individuals learn about the world is based on their environment as a young child. Children are incredible observers, and I think this is something that many individuals underestimate, is the extent to which their actions impact young children. Until children begin to interact with others outside of the home, like in the school environments, family interactions and the home environment are all they know, really. And interactions that children have with their families, in combination with their own temperament, build the foundation of their behavioral and attitudinal tendencies. Family functionality affects the overall well-being of the child, and this is applicable for both positive and negative family function. The quality of family function has a significant influence on the development and overall well-being of the child. Positive environments will facilitate healthy development, whereas negative environments inhibit development and leave lasting negative effects on the child. And both of these types of environments contribute to the foundation of a child's internal schemas about the world around them. So this could pertain to how children deal with negative emotions, how they treat others that cause them harm, how they treat others in general, and their own ideas about functional friendships with peers. And brain development is influenced by both observed and experienced interactions. So the brain develops as neural connections are made, and these connections begin to occur during infancy and do not stop until late adulthood. The prime time for neural connections is childhood, which is why interactions during this time of life are so crucial. And the ways that children are treated and observations of how their loved ones are treated during this time affect their ideas and associations pertaining to personal relationships. Children carry their acquired foundation from childhood with them as they grow older. So, potential problems within the family system. A potential problem that families will face, and something that I wanted to center this presentation around, was abuse inside and outside of the home. And we hear about families dealing with issues of abuse, but it's important to think about what this actually means. And this could relate to several things, and it can take several forms. And it could take the position of the following. It could be direct abuse, whether it be physical, emotional, and or sexual, to the child from a caregiver, a family member, or an individual outside of the family. It could just be a neglectful caregiver. It could be domestic violence between adults and or siblings inside the home that the children witnesses and isn't necessarily a part of. So any of the things that I just listed, they're all different as far as content, but they each do take a negative toll on the individual, and each has a direct effect on the overall function of the family. So what one family member experiences does indeed have a ripple effect on other family members within the family system. So even if abuse does not happen directly to the child, but say to the caregiver, for example, a mom being abused by her significant other, The observed interaction affects the child's perceptions of relationships. And in addition to this, the way that the caregiver is treated in turn affects the way that the child is treated. So for example, if the mother is being abused by her significant other, how does the mother treat the child after the abuse? Or is she short-tempered, or is she on her nerves more often? These are all things to think about and are part of that ripple effect that I just mentioned. And this also reminds me of two sayings. If mom isn't happy, no one is happy, or happy wife, happy life. It's things that I've heard people joke about growing up, but the same concept is applicable not only to adults in the family systems, but also to younger children. And abusive events that happen to the younger children do affect how they are both viewed and treated by other members of the family, especially when in specific cases when abuse is direct to the child and intrafamilial. We may begin to ask questions like what family members were involved. Do these families live in the home? If they do, what steps are being taken, and what specific aspects of the family system are being affected by the abuse and are changing after the fact. So we make the transition here to talk about specifically adversity that children experience when faced with abuse. We want to start to ask ourselves, what types of issues are children faced with, and how do these issues affect their daily function? So we know that families dealing with abuse should undoubtedly keep the well-being of their children as a priority, but what exactly does this mean? What are some things to look out for when we know a child has witnessed and or experienced some type of abuse? Abuse affects children at both cognitive and psychosocial levels, not just one or the other, not just brain function and they can go about their days normally. It's something that affects every aspect of who they are, and it affects how they treat other people. Most of the issues that children face relating to abuse are actually traced back to the traumatic event itself and the lasting connections that it has made in the brain. So trauma and abuse are not things to be taken lightly, for their effect on the child is extremely detrimental, and that's something that we'll get into a little bit more in detail here. So I found it important to define trauma and think about what it means. The book Helping Abused and Trauma, the book Creative Interventions, defines trauma as an experience that creates a lasting, substantial, psychosocial, and somatic impact on the child. So trauma is not something that should be taken lightly or is used to describe a non-detrimental event. And there are actually two types of trauma. The first being type 1 or acute, which is just a single event happening, or type 2, which is chronic, which is multiple or cumulative events. Traumatic experiences are the types to leave a lasting, scarring impression on an individual. There are events that humans should never have to experience because of the type of toll that they take on the human mind. So the effect of trauma is not just something that each of us can relate to, if that makes sense. So we can't begin to fathom the effects of the events that some individuals on this earth go through, just because they are so traumatic. So when we're talking about trauma and experiences, we want to be able to know what kinds of effects that they leave on children, because they relate to the issues that families deal with when confronting issues such as abuse within the family systems. So traumatic experiences do leave an impact on the following. So affect regulation, neurological functioning, and self-concept. Traumatic experiences do affect the cognitive function of a child, just as an experience of a family member ripples into the lives of other family members. It's important to note here that the effect of traumatic experience ripples into different aspects of the individual in a similar way. So the effect is not solely seen in cognitive function or solely seen in social interactions. Instead, it is reflected in every aspect of the self. And since the brain is in a vulnerable developmental state, experiences like these have detrimental effects on neural connections, which is perhaps the most detrimental part of all of this, is the way that the brain gets wired through traumatic interactions. Children that suffer from developmental trauma experience multiple traumatic events, which makes them even more susceptible to negative impacts. So when the brain is constantly exposed to something traumatic, the brain's connections get made in a way that is unhealthy for the child in the broader scheme of things. But the child is just reacting and coping in the best way possible for what they're going through. But it's not healthy. It's not something that humans should have to experience. It's not a way that the brain should ever have to develop. And the way that this happens is it creates a secondary psychological response for the children. So the individuals that have undergone these types of situations will develop coping mechanisms when they feel threatened. And these become such second nature to them, is what another word for this is. They just begin to react. Their somatic nervous system has built up a response to help the body deal with what's going on. And this is often seen in dissociation. Children will just kind of check out mentally to deal with what's going on. They may act aggressively. They may take on a different personality, things like that to deal with the trauma that they're facing. So when we're looking at the child and as an individual, we want to think about, be able to recognize things that become difficult for them. I found this helpful to mention because on a day-to-day basis, I know with my experiences volunteering with children, you might run into misbehavior a lot, and something that runs through my mind is, well, I wonder where that's stemming from. I wonder what's going on at home. Because like I've mentioned before, these young kids, all they know is what's going on at home, and that's their example, and that's all that they know how to act out in the school environment. So we'll see that it's difficult for them to trust others, to open up to people. There is a previous misconception that Bruce Perry talks about a little bit in one of his books, that children are incessantly resilient without the need of much professional attention. And I think that part of this is right, that children are resilient. Children are able to bounce back from what happens to them. But in order for them to reach their potential to be resilient, they need the correct tools. So if left untreated, the negative coping mechanisms continue to fester, and these characteristics grow to be major aspects of the individual's personality. So things like trusting others and interacting with peers, adapting to new situations, having a difficulty acquiring a positive sense of self, these are all aspects that have the potential to become permanent parts of a child's personality if they don't get the right tools, if they don't get the right help. And that's why it's important for professionals and adults surrounding children to know how to recognize these things, to begin to help these children move forward in positive ways. And once revisiting trusting others. So once trust is broken repeatedly in childhood, individuals become rather closed off to most adults and will act in ways that push them away rather than bring them closer. And this is applicable for peers as well. Most of the time we won't see children that have undergone traumatic experiences. We won't see them having healthy relationships with their peers. We'll see them acting out aggressively, pushing others away for negative attention. We'll see them deliberately sabotaging other children as far as taking toys or ruining something that they're working on or something, or things relating to that. We might even see isolation from their peers as well, not wanting to interact, kind of just keeping to themselves because that's how they know to be safe, is not to have interactions with other people. Adapting to new situations becomes difficult because the child has no structure really of how to cope properly with change. And in order to successfully adapt to new situations, an example must be set, right? So a consistent and predictable environment is necessary, but this is not typically the type of home environment that a traumatized child will grow up in. It's typically unpredictable. It's typically painful at random times, so they constantly need to be on their guard. They constantly need to be ready to deal with the abuse, and it gets difficult because children need routine, children need predictability, and without this, they're not able to learn how to adapt to new situations or how to utilize their skills or how to recognize their strengths and weaknesses in certain situations. Mostly they'll be focused on their weaknesses, and mostly they'll be feeling bad about what's going on in their lives, right? Because obviously these types of experiences, they won't elicit positive emotions in any human being, especially in a child whose emotional expressions are still at a vulnerable state. So acquiring a positive sense of self, which is one of Erickson's stages, even is difficult. It's hard for them to establish a sense of self, a sense of initiative is the word I'm looking for. So trusting others and having personal initiative is very difficult for children who don't have this basis or who don't have a healthy environment growing up at all, that are experiencing these types of situations. So another thing that we see is controlling behavior becomes difficult for individuals that have experienced traumatic situations. Both affect and physical control become issues for children that have experienced trauma, and it's rather difficult for them to process their emotions after a traumatic event. It's difficult for young children to process their emotions no matter what at this point in time, let alone after a traumatic event. And it's common for these children to just shut down when they become uncomfortable and or act out aggressively when they feel angry. You know, they're not sure how to express their emotions, and they're feeling so many of them at one time that it becomes difficult for them to just control behavior after that point. Another thing that becomes difficult is revisiting the abuse and having effective communication as far as discussing or verbally explaining the abuse. Revisiting the trauma is difficult for the children, and I imagine it would be difficult for anyone really. Just to fathom some things that children go through in this world is hard enough, let alone having to have it happen to you excuse me, personally, and then having to explain it afterwards at such a young age is such an unfathomable thing to have to do. When memory about these types of events are stored, much of it is actually repressed into implicit memory as opposed to explicit memory, which makes it difficult for the child to retrieve what happened. And it also makes it difficult for the child to directly state what happened, since language about the event is not readily available in implicit memory just quite yet, according to the book Creative Interventions. So after hearing all this about traumatic experiences and how it affects the child, both the cognitive and psychosocial effects of the trauma seem to have an incredibly powerful control over the mind of the child. And there might be some doubt that positivity can come from these events that these children experience in the world. But with the right tools and professional help, children and their families can be led down a beneficial path of recovery. So there is a positive to this. There is a way for professionals to to intervene to make the lives of these children and these families better, and to help them move forward in positive ways. So we want to think about how professionals can begin to help affected children and their families. And in order to help children, we must think outside of the treatment box, if you will. Traditional therapeutic strategies that are beneficial for adults are seldom beneficial for young children in the same ways. Children are creative beings, and we as adults and professionals must come to an understanding that they are in need of opportunities to express themselves in different ways than adults. So, the book Creative Interventions talks about the advantage of creative arts therapies. And there are incredible advantages that I read about, and that are being done every day with children, helping them move forward in positive ways. And these types of therapies really give children new opportunities for creativity and control and trust, and it really gives children the time to be themselves in a place that is free of emotional and physical harm, as well as free from negative judgment. Children are able to explore their creative abilities more and more with each session, while building upon parts of their neural networks that were never able to develop correctly. The brain plasticity is indeed present in young children, but it takes time and consistency to get the brain to where it should be after a traumatic event. Giving the child the feeling of control is a crucial element in these types of therapies. The affected children did not experience control of their abuse, nor did they have control of how their body reacted to their thoughts, or reminders of their abuse after it happened. And creative arts therapy gives children the opportunity to tell their story in their own way and on their own terms. This is something that's incredibly important for these children. It lets their subconscious explore things that they've never thought about before, that they've never even know that they might even be thinking about, but it's stored in their memory, and it's wired in their brain at that point in time. And creative art therapy really gives therapists the opportunity to seek problems indirectly and treat problems indirectly while building a positive relationship with the child, which is incredible. These therapy sessions help the affected child build a healthy, predictable, and safe relationship with an adult in their life, which is an important step to recovery, especially for a child that has been betrayed by adults, by an adult or multiple adults in his or her past. So when we're talking about trauma and experiences, we want to be able to know what kinds of effects that they leave on children, because they relate to the issues that families deal with when confronting issues such as abuse within the family systems. So traumatic experiences do leave an impact on the following: so affect regulation, neurological functioning, and self-concept. Traumatic experiences do affect the cognitive function of a child, just as an experience of a family member ripples into the lives of other family members. It's important to note here that the effect of traumatic experience ripples into different aspects of the individual in a similar way. So the effect is not solely seen in cognitive function or solely seen in social interactions. Instead, it is reflected in every aspect of the self. And since the brain is in a vulnerable developmental state, experiences like these have detrimental effects on neural connections, which is perhaps the most detrimental part of all of this, is the way that the brain gets wired through traumatic interactions. Children that suffer from developmental trauma experience multiple traumatic events, which makes them even more susceptible to negative impacts. So when the brain is constantly exposed to something traumatic, the brain's connections get made in a way that is unhealthy for the child in the broader scheme of things. But the child is just reacting and coping in the best way possible for what they're going through. But it's not healthy. It's not something that humans should have to experience. It's not a way that the brain should. So at this time, I'd like to kind of bring back in and reintroduce the role of the family system, because it's not lost here with helping the child move forward in positive ways, especially considering that abuse doesn't just affect one part of the family. It affects all parts of the family. And support is a key factor for recovering children. So, though therapy and creative interventions are extremely helpful steps to take towards recovery from traumatic experiences, it takes reinforcement of the home environment to maintain progress. Excuse me. So families must remain vigilant and supportive in order for progress to continue outside of the therapist's office. Family members should seek to remain sensitive to the newfound needs of the child in the home, no matter the living situation. So this applies to a foster home, an adoptive home, or a home with biological caregivers. The family environment must remain accepting and understanding, and above all, it must remain predictable for the child. Children look to others for reassurance and support, and it is the duty of the family to keep these aspects a priority. And an informed family has a better understanding of expectations and proactive steps to take towards recovery. And so this is applicable not only for families that are directly dealing with issues of abuse, but also families that are seeking preventative measures as well. The more the family members know about the effects of trauma, the better. So the ideal environment for a recovering child, what does that look like? So Dr. Perry has this book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and he has this quote in there that I think paints a perfect picture of the point I was trying to get across here. And it reads, "Troubled children are in some kind of pain, and pain makes people irritable, anxious, and aggressive. Only patient, loving, and consistent care works, and there are no short-term miracle cures." So children need a predictable and consistent, loving, supportive, and patient environment in order to get better. Children need consistency, and connections in the brain are made through repetition. So in order for the damaged young brain of an affected child to repair itself, a suitable environment is needed for a long period of time. So these aspects of the family system and home environment are keys to a positive recovery for a traumatized child. So how can families work to prevent these issues with abuse? So as mentioned before, a well-educated family is beneficial. So the more that is known about the effects of trauma and the issues that the families are faced with when dealing with abuse, the quicker families can be to recognize that something is wrong. So families should become informed and be hyper aware of their children's behavior and their actions. And as a family raising a child, it's best to know how to ensure that the child grows up in the most healthy way possible. Individuals must work diligently to facilitate the ideal home environment like we just discussed. and know what signs to look for in children and appropriate steps to take towards recovery. I mean, no matter what we do to prevent traumatic events from happening to the children in today's society, there will always be children suffering, unfortunately, from abuse and or neglect. And the best thing that we can do as citizens is to know how to identify behavioral tendencies that may indicate abuse and act accordingly when they're recognized. So just as a quick recap, we know the role of the family system and the environment in the life of a young child, and how these two play together to shape the brain development and psychosocial development of a young child. How abuse, neglect, and trauma have detrimental effects on child development. Common characteristics of a traumatized child. And how the family system can work to enhance recovery and to take preventative measures, as well as the ideal environment for a recovering child. So these are my references: Creative Interventions with Traumatized Children, as well as The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. This presentation has been an incredible learning experience. For me, it's been pretty cool putting everything together for informational purposes. Thank you for your time.